The sun cast a somber golden hue over Vatican City as thousands gathered to mourn the passing of Pope Francis. Streets that usually bustled with life now thrummed with quiet reverence, pilgrims and dignitaries from every corner of the globe pressing together in solemn unity. Flags fluttered half-mast over stone buildings, and the cold marble of St. Peter's Basilica reflected the grief that hung heavy in the air. Among the sea of black veils, dark suits, and muted prayers moved Cecilia Marshall, her presence as composed as it was commanding. Dressed in a simple black robe, her posture upright, her steps measured, she held in her hands a single olive branch, a symbol of peace and reconciliation. Her face bore the dignity of someone accustomed to the heavy weight of public life. Yet today she appeared not as a judge or a diplomat, but as a simple mourner, paying respects to a man who had often spoken on the world stage of justice, equality, and the dignity of all people. Cecilia was no stranger to solemn ceremonies, no stranger to danger either. As a presiding judge at the International Court of Justice, she had prosecuted war crimes, defended the rights of the oppressed, and faced down threats from some of the world's most dangerous individuals. But here, surrounded by the faithful and the grieving, she felt only the raw, unfiltered pain of loss. Pope Francis had not merely been a religious leader, he had been a beacon, a figure who dared to champion the marginalized, to call out hypocrisy, and to envision a world ruled not by domination, but by compassion. Her steps slowed as she approached the steps of the basilica. Rows of Swiss guards in full regalia lined the entryway, their halberds gleaming under the dim sun. International dignitaries whispered in subdued tones as they waited their turn to enter the sacred hall where the casket lay in state. On the outer perimeter of the crowd, tension simmered. Security forces from multiple nations, including hand-picked tactical units, had been deployed to ensure the event remained free from incident. Among them was Officer Michael Dean, a mid-level security operative from the United States, temporarily assigned to the Vatican at the request of diplomatic protection services. Dean was on edge. The responsibility of guarding such a volatile event weighed heavily on his shoulders, exacerbated by his own internalized biases and unchecked fears. From his vantage point near the second security ring, he scanned the crowd with clinical coldness, his gaze resting longer than necessary on those who, in his mind, didn't fit the standard image of visiting mourners. When he spotted Cecilia, his instincts sharpened, not out of any logical threat assessment, but from the poisoned brew of stereotypes festering inside him. A black woman, alone, carrying something unfamiliar. It was enough. His hand hovered near his concealed weapon as he muttered a quick update into his earpiece. Possible threat near the west steps. Moving to intercept. No order had been given. No actual threat had been identified. But Michael Dean moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd with a forceful, almost predatory energy. Cecilia had paused by a marble pillar, her head bowed, whispering a private prayer. She did not notice Dean closing the distance, did not sense the sudden predatory fix upon her until it was too late. Without warning, Dean's hand clamped down hard on her shoulder, wrenching her backward, sending the olive branch tumbling from her grasp. Gasps erupted from those nearby, muffled but piercing in the heavy silence. Some stepped back in fear, others watched frozen in horror as Dean roughly spun Cecilia around, barking commands in English she could barely process through the shock. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Years of courtroom battles, of resisting intimidation, had ingrained in her a spine of steel. She stiffened, meeting Dean's gaze with unwavering calm even as his grip bruised her arm. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the prayerful murmurs. Dean's response was to shove her roughly against the cold stone pillar, frisking her with exaggerated, almost punishing force. The olive branch lay crushed underfoot, a simple token of peace desecrated by paranoia and prejudice. Cameras, forbidden inside the main procession, were absent. Witnesses had only their eyes, their memories, and their gathering outrage. The disruption rippled outward. A few security officers turned, confusion evident in their faces. Vatican guards frowned but hesitated, waiting for clarification through official channels. Meanwhile, Dean radioed a false confirmation to his superiors. Object secured. Possible device neutralized. He cuffed Cecilia's wrists behind her back with plastic ties, not bothering to verify her identity, not noticing the diplomatic insignia subtly embroidered on her robe's sleeve, nor the credential badge that had fallen to the floor in the scuffle. Cecilia gritted her teeth against the pain. Humiliation flooded her veins hot and fast, but she refused to give Dean the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her pride, her dignity, were all she had in that moment. She was well aware of the symbolism unfolding. Here, under the soaring dome of St. Peter's, before the eyes of world leaders and grieving pilgrims, a black woman of global stature was being publicly degraded without cause. Dean barked something she didn't catch, his voice a white-hot mixture of fear and aggression, and began marching her toward a side entrance, shoving her through the tide of mourners. It took several heartbeats for the shock to wear off among the bystanders. When it did, a wave of murmured protests rose behind them. People turned, some reaching out as if to intervene, others simply staring in appalled disbelief. Still, no one moved fast enough to stop the unfolding tragedy. Cecilia's heart hammered in her chest, not from fear of physical harm. She could handle that, but from the deeper, colder fear that even here, in this sacred place, centuries of prejudice still found new ways to thrive. In the wings of the basilica, Cardinal Giovanni Bellini, a trusted advisor of the late Pope, had witnessed the commotion from a side altar. His old eyes narrowed with fury and alarm. He signaled sharply to his aides and began moving toward the scene with surprising speed for a man of his years. Meanwhile, Dean, oblivious to the unfolding consequences of his actions, dragged Cecilia toward a small windowless holding room used for internal security breaches. She stumbled once, her heel catching on the edge of a centuries-old stone tile, but she righted herself before Dean could jerk her forward again. The room was barren, lit by a single harsh bulb, its air thick with mildew. Dean shoved her against a chair, roughly ordering her to sit. Cecilia complied, slowly, every movement calculated. She would not give this man, or anyone like him, the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Instead, she lifted her chin, locking eyes with him, daring him to look closer, at her, at his mistake, at the depth of his disgrace. But Dean refused to meet her gaze. Already, somewhere deep inside, he knew he had crossed a line that would not be erased by paperwork or procedure. Outside, a growing murmur filled the basilica. Word of the disturbance traveled fast. Diplomats from Africa, South America, and even Europe whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened. The disruption had interrupted the solemn reading of Psalms. An eerie unease infected the entire ceremony. People who had come to honor a man of peace were now witnesses to an act of brutal injustice played out against the very ideals he had cherished. Cardinal Bellini pushed through the inner sanctum doors just as Dean secured the room. His face was grim, his voice cutting. "Open this door. Now." Behind him, 2 Vatican guards stood stiffly, their hands resting lightly on ceremonial swords. Dean, realizing too late that he was not in control of the situation, hesitated. Cecilia remained seated, breathing slow, steady, her hands still bound but her spirit unbroken. The door creaked open and the cardinal entered, his presence filling the small suffocating space with an authority that no badge or uniform could counterfeit. His eyes scanned the scene in one glance. The crushed olive branch, the woman bound and bruised, the American officer standing stiff and defensive. And then, with a voice so calm it chilled the air, Cardinal Bellini spoke. "You have committed a sin against peace, a sin against justice, and a sin against the memory of a great man. You will answer for it." The words hung in the stale air between them, heavier than any chains. Michael Dean stood frozen, the words of Cardinal Bellini reverberating in his skull like the toll of a funeral bell. His fingers twitched uselessly at his side, still yearning for the comforting weight of authority that now slipped through them like smoke. He opened his mouth to protest, to concoct some weak excuse about suspected threats, protocols, and misunderstandings. But before he could stammer a defense, Bellini raised one hand, silencing him with nothing more than a look of pure disdain. The two Vatican guards at his side moved forward, not with weapons drawn but with the inexorable certainty of centuries of tradition behind them. Dean instinctively backed a step toward Cecilia, as if proximity to his prisoner might somehow shield him from the storm he had summoned upon himself. Cecilia, still seated, still bound, observed the unfolding scene with the cold clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime parsing the true nature of power. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Every breath she drew was a condemnation more eloquent than any speech. Bellini turned his gaze to her next, his sharp, papery hand extending gently toward the plastic ties cutting into her wrists. With a quiet murmur in Italian, he ordered one of his aides to release her. The young man, pale and trembling, hurried forward with a small knife, severing the bindings with a careful swipe. Cecilia pulled her hands forward slowly, the red welts on her skin stark against the black fabric of her robe. Dean shifted again, sweat gathering under the heavy Kevlar weave of his uniform. He could feel it now, something beyond simple reprimand looming just out of sight, something irreversible. Bellini spoke again, this time in English, his voice low but carrying the weight of iron. You have violated sacred ground with your arrogance. You have assaulted a guest of the Holy See. There will be no shield for you here. Without waiting for a response, he motioned to the guards. Escort this man out of the basilica. Strip him of his credentials. He is no longer welcome among us. The guards moved with grim efficiency, flanking Dean and relieving him of his ID badge, his radio, his firearm. Dean stiffened as one of them yanked the weapon from its holster with a disgusted sneer. He opened his mouth again to protest, but a warning look from the older guard snapped it shut. He was no longer an officer here. He was a liability, a stain to be scrubbed from the holy walls. One guard took hold of his arm and pulled him from the room without ceremony. His boots scraped against the ancient marble as he stumbled after them. No longer a figure of authority, but a defeated, pitiful man whose only defense had been stripped from him alongside his badge. Bellini turned back to Cecilia, who was massaging her sore wrists. For a moment, the heavy silence stretched between them. Then, with the tender care of a grandfather, the cardinal lowered himself onto one knee before her and bowed his head. "Forgive us," he said simply. There was no dramatic flourish, no grand speech, only a simple, soul-wrenching apology, given where the entire basilica could soon see and hear it if they cared to look beyond the marble walls. Cecilia blinked, her throat tightening in spite of herself. This was not a moment she had ever imagined. Not after years spent battling courts that turned a blind eye, officials who treated apologies as bargaining chips. Here, in the heart of Christendom, a man humbled himself before her with no expectation of mercy, no hidden agenda. She nodded once, slow and solemn, and Bellini rose with a grace that belied his age. Meanwhile, outside the holding room, chaos brewed. Word of the incident had seeped into the ranks of mourners and dignitaries alike. Whispers churned the solemn air into something sharp and dangerous. Delegates from Africa and Latin America demanded immediate explanations. Bishops muttered furious prayers under their breath. Even members of the Swiss Guard shifted uneasily, sensing the magnitude of the violation that had just occurred on their watch. By the time Cecilia and Bellini emerged, the tide had turned into a storm. Vatican officials scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was too late for backdoor solutions. An informal tribunal had already been convened among the higher-ranking cardinals and papal advisors, who understood the stakes all too well. If news of this injustice leaked, and it would, It would be a scandal that could undermine not only the sanctity of Pope Francis's funeral but the very moral authority of the Church itself. Bellini, still standing firm beside Cecilia, knew what had to happen, and he knew it had to happen now. He led Cecilia into the nave of the basilica, where the mourners had resumed their slow, shuffling progression past the Pope's casket. The great organ rumbled low, a river of sound beneath the murmured prayers. Bellini paused before the assembled cardinals, his robes catching the dying light pouring through the stained glass windows. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear. Today, injustice was visited upon one who came in peace. We will not hide it. We will not excuse it. The Holy Father, whom we honor today, would demand no less than full redress. He gestured to Cecilia, who stood straight and unyielding, a figure cut from the same cloth as the martyrs depicted on the cathedral's soaring ceilings. This woman, Judge Cecilia Marshall, came here as a friend of the Church, a defender of human dignity, a voice for the voiceless. She was treated instead as a criminal, without cause, without conscience. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Some clergy crossed themselves instinctively, as if warding off the evil of the moment. Bellini continued, "As long as I draw breath, I will not allow this wound to fester in silence." Turning to one of the altar attendants, he gave a small nod. The attendant hurried forward with a small, ornate case, a box that had rested upon the altar beside the Pope's casket. Inside, cushioned by white silk, lay a new set of prayer beads, handcrafted in the Vatican workshop, blessed personally by Pope Francis before his death, meant for the next champion of peace. Bellini lifted them carefully, the beads glinting like stars under the basilica's high lights, and he stepped towards Cecilia. He placed the prayer beads into her outstretched hands. "These," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "belong to a man who dreamed of a world where no soul need bow to injustice. Carry them now, not as a burden, but as a testament." The congregation watched, transfixed. There were no shouts, no applause, only the sacred silence of true understanding. Cecilia closed her fingers around the beads, feeling the weight of them, not just in her hands, but in her heart. She bowed her head, not in subjugation, but in solemn acceptance. In the dim edges of the basilica, the disgraced figure of Michael Dean was dragged past the watching mourners. His jacket was torn, his radio discarded, his face pale and drawn. No longer a protector, no longer even an observer. He had become the living embodiment of what Pope Francis had fought all his life to overcome. He disappeared into the shadows beyond the nave, and no one reached out to stop him. No one wept for him. Cecilia turned her gaze back to the casket, to the simple, unadorned wood that held the remains of the man who had called the world to mercy. The beads warmed in her palm as if alive. She stepped forward in the slow, sacred procession, her every step a silent prayer, her very presence now a living sermon louder than any words. Justice had been broken that day, but dignity, true, incorruptible dignity, had risen in its place, tall and unyielding beneath the ancient dome of St. Peter's. The Vatican's ancient walls had witnessed centuries of triumph and betrayal, coronations and executions, but rarely had they held their breath as they did now. Beneath the intricate mosaics and towering columns of St. Peter's Basilica, something raw and violent had been unleashed, and it was not going to fade quietly into marble silence. As Cecilia moved away from the altar, carrying the blessed prayer beads in her hands, a tremor ran through the gathering, a shift in the atmosphere as if the great edifice itself recoiled from the desecration it had just been forced to host. Yet the story was not over. Not yet. Far from submitting to disgrace, Michael Dean had not accepted his fate. Dragged through the outer corridors by the Vatican guards, stripped of his badge and weapon, his mind seethed with poisonous rage. He replayed the moment of humiliation over and over in his head. The sight of Cecilia standing above him, the prayer beads gleaming like a crown in her hand, the cold dismissal of his authority by men he considered soft, obsolete. It wasn't just anger burning in him now. It was something deeper, a festering refusal to believe that he could be wrong, that his instincts, sharpened by years of unchecked prejudice, had betrayed him so catastrophically. In the dim corridors behind the basilica, where ancient frescoes peeled away from the walls and the echoes of history lingered like ghosts, Dean found his opportunity. One of the younger guards, distracted by the weight of the unfolding scandal, failed to notice as Dean twisted his arm violently, wrenching free from the restraint. A sharp grunt, a muffled thud against the stone wall, and Dean was free, running deeper into the underbelly of the Vatican like a wounded animal. The commotion reached the main hall almost instantly. Shouts echoed down the corridors, followed by the hurried clatter of boots on marble. The cardinals turned their heads sharply, murmuring in alarm. Swiss guards repositioned themselves at key entry points, but the basilica was vast, riddled with hidden passages and ancient service routes unknown even to many of its own caretakers. Somewhere in those labyrinthine depths, a rogue agent was now loose, armed with nothing but rage and the unyielding belief that he had been wronged. Cecilia sensed the change before she heard it. Her years in courtrooms dealing with predators and tyrants had taught her to read the air the way others read newspapers. The tension thickened like coagulating blood, and she instinctively shifted her body to face the nearest exit route. Bellini, ever the strategist despite his years, stepped closer to her, shielding her slightly with his body as the first real wave of panic rippled through the mourners. Suddenly, from a side archway, Dean appeared, disheveled, eyes wild, shirt ripped open to reveal the Kevlar vest underneath. His gaze locked onto Cecilia with a manic intensity, his whole body coiled for violence. In that moment, no words were necessary. It wasn't about threats or warnings anymore. It was a charge, an assault on everything he believed had stolen his imagined authority. He sprinted toward her, hands curled into fists. The Swiss guards closest to the altar reacted instantly, but Dean was fast, driven by the desperate strength of humiliation and hate. The first guard he reached tried to intercept him, but was bowled over by a brutal shoulder strike. Another lunged, but Dean's boot connected viciously with his knee, sending the armored man sprawling. Cecilia had no time to think, only act. She pivoted on her heel, tossing the prayer beads into Bellini's hands as she moved. She would not allow a symbol of peace to be tainted by the violence bearing down upon them. Dean reached her just as she completed her turn, his hands outstretched to grab her by the throat. But Cecilia had not survived warlords and tribunals by being passive. She sidestepped his first lunge, her elbow shooting up into his ribs with a sharp, practiced movement that forced a gasp from his lungs. Dean staggered, but did not stop. His hand snatched the loose sleeve of her robe and yanked, pulling her off balance. They fell together in a tangled clash of limbs, crashing into a row of wooden pews that splintered under their weight. Gasps and screams erupted around the basilica. Diplomats and mourners scattered in terror, some shielding their faces, others frozen by the sheer audacity of violence in a place meant to embody peace. Dean pinned Cecilia against the broken wood, his hands scrambling for her throat. She fought back fiercely, her training and willpower the only things keeping the air in her lungs. A knee to his side, a sharp rake of her nails across his forearm. Small victories that bought seconds. Bellini shouted orders to the guards, his voice thunderous, but they struggled to reach the combatants through the panicked throng. Dean's hand closed around Cecilia's neck, squeezing, his face inches from hers, his breath ragged and sour. "You think you're better than me," he hissed through clenched teeth. Cecilia choked, her hand scrabbling for leverage, her vision tunneling as oxygen fled her brain. But even as darkness threatened the edges of her consciousness, she found her opening. She brought her forehead crashing into Dean's nose with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across her face, hot and metallic. Dean howled, recoiling just long enough for Cecilia to drive her knee upward with brutal precision. Dean collapsed backward onto the marble, clutching his face. 2 Swiss guards reached them a heartbeat later. One pinned Dean's arms behind his back, while the other forced him face down against the floor, the stone smeared red from his nosebleed. Cecilia sagged against the broken pew, her chest heaving, but she refused to collapse completely. She wiped the blood from her face with the sleeve of her robe, every muscle in her body trembling with rage and exertion. Bellini reached her side, his hands hovering anxiously as if unsure whether he could touch her without further offending her dignity. She gave him a curt nod, accepting his presence without words. She could not speak yet. Her throat burned from the near strangulation, and her mind buzzed with the effort of keeping her balance, her dignity, her life. Dean screamed curses at the guards restraining him, spittle flying from his lips. It was not the cry of a wronged man, but the primal, ugly roar of someone who had lost everything and could not bear the mirror of his own actions. Bellini turned to one of his aides and issued a command that brooked no argument. "Take him to the dungeons." Ancient, disused cells beneath the Vatican still existed, remnants of a darker time. For Dean, they would serve well enough. As Dean was dragged away, kicking and swearing, the mourners who had fled now edged back cautiously, drawn by the magnetic pull of catastrophe. Cecilia pushed herself fully upright, wincing as pain lanced through her ribs. Her robe was torn, her hair disheveled, but she stood taller than anyone in that sacred hall. Bellini stepped forward once more, lifting her prayer beads high in one hand, and the basilica's ancient organ began to play a low, mournful chord, as if mourning not only the Pope, but the moral collapse they had all just witnessed. No announcement needed to be made. Everyone understood. A new procession formed with Cecilia at its center. Not a victim, not merely a mourner, but a symbol. The story of the funeral would no longer be only about loss. It would be about resistance, about survival, about the price of dignity in a world that still, even now, tried to deny it to some. As they processed, past the altar, past the tombs of saints and martyrs, past the weeping statues and the gilded icons, Cecilia felt a kind of clarity she had not known even in her most righteous court victories. Power, real power, was not in the uniform, not in the weapon, not even in the badge. It was in the refusal to be broken by hatred. It was in the act of standing, of fighting back and still walking forward. Behind her, the broken pews, the smears of blood, the torn robes, they would remain for hours until the Vatican's custodians, hands trembling, dared to clean them away. They would tell the story in whispers for generations. How, on the day the world buried its greatest modern champion of peace, hatred tried to rise and was crushed by the strength of one woman who refused to kneel. And Cecilia, battered but unbowed, would carry that weight forward, a living testimony that even here, even in the heart of sacred ground, justice demanded blood, courage, and the unrelenting will to rise when struck down. The sun, outside St. Peter's Basilica, had begun its slow, inevitable descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the ancient piazza like reaching fingers. Inside, the echoes of the violence that had erupted minutes earlier still hung in the cold air, a palpable stain on the sacred ceremony. Cecilia Marshall, standing upright with every ounce of strength she could muster, was at the center of it all, an unmoving axis around which the brokenness of the day spun. The basilica, once filled with quiet reverence, was now a landscape of whispered shock, hurried footsteps, and eyes that could not seem to look away from her. Bellini stood close by, his presence protective but not overbearing. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder for a moment, a silent gesture of solidarity. Cecilia's breathing slowed, her body still trembling from the brutal confrontation, but she refused to falter. She adjusted her torn robe with mechanical precision, masking the pain radiating from her ribs and throat. She had endured worse in battlefields of law and diplomacy, but never had the assault been so brazen, so raw, or so public. Every bone in her body ached for reprieve, but there would be no retreat now. She knew instinctively This was no longer just about her. The Swiss guards swiftly formed a protective cordon around Cecilia and the remaining mourners, directing them toward the secondary sanctuary deeper within the basilica. This smaller chapel, reserved for cardinals and visiting dignitaries, had been hastily converted into a safe haven. As Cecilia entered the space, her eyes scanned the room. A low ceiling adorned with centuries-old frescoes, candles flickering uncertainly in wrought-iron sconces, the faint scent of myrrh clinging to the air. Chairs were hastily arranged, and Vatican officials, diplomats, and clerics now gathered, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Bellini addressed the gathering with a voice that trembled with controlled fury. "The sanctity of this day has been marred," he began, "but we must act with wisdom, not rage. The world watches. Our response must be measured, and yet unmistakable." Cecilia, still clutching the prayer beads in her hand, felt the weight of the room's expectations shift subtly toward her. She had not asked for this spotlight. She had come to mourn. But fate had other plans. When Bellini turned toward her and inclined his head, a silent invitation, she knew there would be no escaping it. She stepped forward, drawing every eye. "I came here to honor a man who stood for the dignity of all," she said, her voice rough but steady. "But dignity cannot exist without courage. What happened today is not an isolated incident. It is the symptom of a sickness that has gone untreated for too long. The belief that power excuses cruelty, that fear justifies violence, that skin color determines worth." A murmur swept through the room, a collective intake of breath. Diplomats from African nations nodded grimly. Clergy from South America lowered their heads in shame. Even among the European contingent, faces hardened in silent agreement. Cecilia continued, her voice gaining strength. "We honor Pope Francis not by pretending this did not happen, but by confronting it, by making it impossible to ignore." Bellini's aides exchanged quick glances. One of them, a young priest named Matteo, stepped forward with a tablet in his hands. "The Holy See's press office," he said hesitantly. "They request a statement. The world is demanding answers." Bellini turned to Cecilia. "It must come from you." There was no time for scripts, for rehearsed diplomacy. Cecilia nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture, and allowed Matteo to record her message. She spoke directly into the small camera. Her face battered but unbowed, her robe torn but her bearing regal. "My name is Cecilia Marshall. I am a judge at the International Court of Justice. I came to the Vatican today to mourn a man who fought for the dignity of every human soul. I was met with violence, suspicion, and hatred, but I will not respond with hatred in return. I stand here today to say, we are not what they try to make us. We are not defined by the fear they project onto us. We are not less. We never were." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle like dust on the stone floor. The true testament to Pope Francis's legacy is not found in marble or ceremony, but in the refusal to let hatred go unchallenged. "Today, I do not kneel before cruelty. I rise." The room was silent when she finished, the weight of her words pressing against every chest. Matteo nodded solemnly and transmitted the video immediately to the press office. Within minutes, it would be broadcast across continents. A ripple turned tidal wave. Meanwhile, the search for Dean continued in the labyrinth of passages beneath the basilica. Reports came flooding into the sanctuary. Dean had assaulted another guard in the catacombs. He had broken into a restricted area housing sacred relics. He had been seen carrying a makeshift weapon, an iron rod torn from the scaffolding of a restoration project. His descent into madness was nearly complete, and now he was dangerous in ways that protocol could not contain. Bellini convened an emergency council with senior Swiss guards, legal advisors, and diplomats. Cecilia was included without hesitation, her presence now as crucial as any cardinal's. They debated in low, furious tones. Some demanded immediate military action to subdue Dean. Others cautioned restraint, fearing the image of Vatican soldiers storming their own sacred halls would create a political nightmare. Cecilia listened, her mind sharp despite the pain. When Bellini finally turned to her for counsel, she spoke without hesitation. "This man cannot be treated as a simple criminal. His actions are not random. They are ideological. If you pursue him with brute force, you will give his hatred a martyrdom it does not deserve. We must capture him alive. We must expose his actions for what they are. Not rebellion, not courage, but cowardice clothed in violence." The decision was made. A specialized unit of Swiss guards, trained not only in combat but in psychological operations, would intercept Dean. They would neutralize him without bloodshed if possible, and they would do it under the watchful eye of international observers now being gathered discreetly from among the diplomatic corps present. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only move that preserved the dignity of the Holy See and the memory of the man they had all come to mourn. Hours passed like slow poison in the veins. Tension coiled tighter with each passing minute. Night crept over the city, and the basilica's great doors were sealed, trapping the unfolding drama within its hallowed walls. Finally, as the bells tolled vespers, the news came. Dean had been captured. Bruised, bleeding, and incoherent, he was dragged from a forgotten crypt where he had holed up among the relics of saints long dead. His weapon clattered harmlessly to the floor, an impotent symbol of rage defeated. Cecilia was present when he was brought back through the sanctuary. She watched silently as Dean, shackled and humiliated, was paraded past the assembled diplomats, clergy, and mourners. His head hung low, blood matting his hair, his body broken not by her hand, but by his own monstrous failures. He paused as he passed her, lifting his bloodied face. For a moment their eyes met. There was no recognition there, no remorse. Only hollow, empty hatred, a void where humanity should have been. Cecilia felt no triumph, no vindication. Only sorrow. This, too, was the cost of hatred. Not only the suffering of its victims, but the annihilation of the soul that embraced it. Dean was taken away to the underground cells. There would be no press conference, no public spectacle. His punishment would be swift, legal, and absolute, an erasure from history as clean and pitiless as the slash of a blade. As the basilica's organ played once more, a hymn rose through the cavernous space, a hymn not of mourning now, but of endurance, of hope forged in the fires of injustice. And in the midst of that ancient sanctuary, under frescoes that had seen empires rise and fall, Cecilia Marshall stood unbroken. She was not merely surviving, she was prevailing. Night had fully descended upon Vatican City and St. Peter's Basilica loomed against the starless sky like a colossal tomb, its ancient stones holding the memories of both saints and sinners. Inside, the air had turned cold, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on every heart. The organ music had faded into silence, leaving only the distant shuffling of tired feet and the faint murmur of whispered prayers. But peace was still a fragile dream. Beneath the marble floors and hallowed arches, a second, darker current stirred, one that would soon erupt with a violence far more devastating than anyone could yet imagine. Michael Dean, shackled and disgraced, should have been contained, erased like a bad memory. But mistakes had been made in the haste to restore dignity to the ceremony. Somewhere between the moment he was led into the Vatican's lower holding cells and the arrival of the designated security tribunal, Dean managed to exploit a fatal flaw. The guards assigned to watch him, young, inexperienced, and rattled by the enormity of the scandal, had allowed protocol to slip. One moment of inattention, a poorly secured manacle, and the inevitable happened. Dean broke free again. The news hit the inner sanctuary like a lightning strike. Bellini was mid-conversation with senior envoys when a breathless aide burst into the chamber, his face ashen. "He's escaped," the boy gasped, armed himself again, heading for the basilica floor. Chaos followed. Orders clashed against counter-orders, voices rising in panic. Bellini, with a lifetime of navigating crises, seized control with terrifying efficiency. He barked orders to the Swiss guards, called for immediate lockdown, ordered every exit sealed. But deep down, he, and everyone else, knew it might already be too late. Cecilia, who had refused to leave despite the Vatican's entreaties, felt the atmosphere snap taut again. She clenched the prayer beads in her hand, the smooth wood grounding her against the rising storm. This time it would not be a personal attack hidden in a side corridor. Dean had tasted humiliation, had bathed in the rage of his own failure, and now, stripped of any pretense, he would seek to desecrate everything around him. Publicly, violently, irrevocably. And he knew exactly where to strike. The great nave of the basilica, hastily reopened for late-night mourners after the earlier incidents, was full again. Pilgrims kneeling before the casket, clergy chanting low prayers, diplomats whispering among themselves. Into this vulnerable gathering, Dean charged like a weapon loosed from hell itself. He emerged from a side door with a rusted ceremonial spear ripped from the Vatican's neglected armory exhibits. His appearance was monstrous. Shirt torn, blood smeared across his face, eyes wild and blazing. The gasps from the congregation froze the air. Some people screamed. Others dropped to the floor, instinctively shielding themselves from the horror unfolding. Dean didn't hesitate. He sprinted straight for the center of the room, swinging the crude weapon wildly, knocking over candelabras, shattering statues, desecrating every sacred symbol he could reach. The Swiss guards reacted immediately, but Dean was moving like a man possessed, immune to pain, immune to reason. Bellini stepped forward without hesitation, arms spread wide, positioning himself between Dean and the gathered mourners. "Stop this madness!" he thundered, but Dean only snarled in response, hurling the spear. It missed by inches, splintering against a marble column in an explosion of dust and stone. Guards rushed him then, tackling Dean to the ground in a brutal pile. But he fought like a cornered animal, biting, clawing, shrieking obscenities that echoed from the gilded ceilings. Even as they overwhelmed him, even as he was pinned and chained and crushed under the weight of justice, his voice howled through the basilica. "You think you're better. You think you've won. You haven't. You'll never win." The ugliness of his words hung in the sacred air like a stain. It took 6 guards to finally subdue him. His hands were bound behind his back with reinforced chains this time, his body writhing like a broken thing. Yet the damage had already been done. Statues of saints lay smashed, candles guttered into smoking ruins, priceless icons marred by the senseless rampage of one man's hatred unleashed. And at the center of it all stood Cecilia, unmoving, her face carved from granite. She watched it unfold without flinching, even as others wept, even as others turned away in shame. There was no fear left in her, only a grim, heavy sorrow. Dean was dragged once again through the basilica, his body a ruin of rage and blood. The crowd parted for him not in fear, but in revulsion, as though an ancient plague had been loosed among them. No longer merely a disgraced officer, he had become a symbol of everything that Pope Francis had warned against: the tyranny of fear, the worship of violence, the poison of pride. As the guards disappeared into the bowels of the Vatican, Bellini approached Cecilia. His face, usually so composed, was cracked open by grief. "We have failed," he said simply. "We allowed this evil to be born among us. We must bear its stain." Cecilia placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but unbreakable. "You haven't failed. You faced it. You didn't look away. That's more than most can say." At that moment, the bells of the basilica began to toll. Not for mass, not for ceremony, but in mourning for the violence that had desecrated their sacred ground. The mourners gathered, bruised in spirit, but not in will. Candles were relit. Statues were carefully covered with white cloths in a ritual of mourning. The wreckage would be left untouched for now, a reminder, a penance, a testimony. Bellini called the people to prayer, but not in Latin, not in formal liturgy. He called them to prayer in every language spoken among them, a cacophony of grief and hope rising into the wounded air. In English, in Spanish, in Swahili, in Tagalog, in Arabic, the prayers wove together like a tapestry of human resilience. Cecilia remained standing among them, battered but upright. She felt the vibration of every whispered prayer, every choked sob, every vow never to let this happen again. And then Bellini did something unprecedented. He called Cecilia to the altar. With shaking hands, he handed her the microphone meant for the homily. Before thousands, before God, he offered her the voice stolen from her by hatred. Cecilia stepped up to the ancient pulpit, the prayer beads still wrapped tightly around her bruised fingers, and she spoke. "Today," she said, her voice carrying with startling clarity through the shattered silence, "we have seen what hate can do when left unchallenged. We have witnessed how fear, when fed and nurtured, can destroy even the most sacred spaces. But we have also seen something else. We have seen that courage does not come from violence. It comes from standing in the face of it and refusing to bow." She looked over the crowd, her eyes meeting the gaze of bishops, of ambassadors, of ordinary pilgrims who had traveled across oceans to be here. "We mourn not just for Pope Francis today," she continued, "but for every dream crushed by cruelty, for every life marred by prejudice, for every soul denied its dignity. And we vow, not in anger, but in love, that hatred will not have the last word here, not in this place, not in this lifetime." The final words hung in the air like a sacred command. The congregation rose to its feet as one, the sound of their movement like a living wave of solidarity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the great organ began to play again, not the dirge of mourning, but a hymn of resilience, swelling with impossible beauty through the wounded halls. Outside, the stars finally emerged from behind their heavy curtain of clouds, casting their silver blessings down upon the basilica. Inside, among the shattered statues and broken pews, something stronger than vengeance took root. Hope. The first light of dawn broke over Vatican City, casting the ancient stones of St. Peter's Basilica in hues of cold gold and pale blue. It was a new day, but the night's wounds remained visible everywhere. The shattered statues, the overturned pews, the scorched patches where sacred candles had been snuffed out in the chaos. Workers moved quietly through the grand hall, careful not to disturb the heavy silence that still gripped the heart of the basilica. They wore gloves, reverently gathering debris into cloth-lined baskets, as though each broken piece were a relic of something too sacred to discard without ceremony. In the smaller sanctuary, just off the main hall, Cecilia Marshall sat in a simple wooden chair, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that gnawed at every fiber of her being. Her ribs ached fiercely from the earlier struggle, and her throat still bore faint bruises from Dean's assault. Yet her gaze was sharp, her mind clear. She had refused offers of medical attention until everything had been properly concluded. Pain could wait. Justice could not. Bellini entered the chamber carrying a leather-bound folder, his face lined deeper than the night before. He placed it gently on the table before Cecilia. "It is done," he said quietly. The tribunal convened. The decision was unanimous. Cecilia nodded, but did not immediately reach for the folder. She did not need to read the words to know their meaning. Michael Dean had been formally condemned not only by the Vatican's internal courts, but by a coalition of international observers hastily assembled from the mourning dignitaries. His actions had been declared not merely a breach of law, but a violation of the fundamental tenets of human dignity and international peace. He would be extradited, not hidden or protected, to face a higher court, beyond the reach of bureaucratic excuses. Bellini hesitated, then added, "The Holy See will issue an unprecedented formal apology. To you, to your court, to every person whose faith was wounded by what happened here." Still, Cecilia did not move. She stared for a long moment at the morning light filtering through the high stained glass, the colors bleeding onto the stone floor like the remnants of some great battle. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the heavy, solemn understanding that even in victory there were scars left behind. "I don't need their apology," she said at last, her voice low but firm. "I need them to remember." Bellini's lips tightened into a small, sad smile. "They will," he promised. In the hours that followed, the basilica's great doors were opened again to the public. But this time, no effort was made to hide the scars of the previous night. The broken statues were left uncovered. The shattered glass was not swept away. The blood-stained stones were not scrubbed clean. The Pope's casket remained at the altar, surrounded now by visible reminders of the hatred he had spent his life preaching against. It was not a funeral any longer. It was a reckoning. Cecilia walked among the mourners as they returned, not as a victim to be pitied, nor as a hero to be exalted, but simply as herself, a woman who had refused to bow to injustice. She saw the way people looked at her now, some with shame, some with gratitude, some with an odd respect that made her uncomfortable. She had not asked for any of it. She had only acted when action was demanded. Near the altar, a group of children knelt together, their small hands folded in prayer. They had come with their families from all corners of the world, their innocence untouched by the political games of their elders. As Cecilia passed, one little girl, no more than 6 or 7, looked up at her with wide, wondering eyes. She held something clutched tightly in her hands, a broken piece of marble from one of the destroyed statues. Without a word, the child extended the shard toward Cecilia. For a moment, Cecilia hesitated. Then she knelt carefully, ignoring the protest of her battered ribs, and accepted the offering. The piece was cold and jagged in her palm, a fragment of beauty broken by violence. She met the child's gaze and saw not fear, but hope, pure and untainted. "Thank you," Cecilia whispered. The child smiled shyly and returned to her prayers. Bellini watched from a distance, his heart heavy but full. Later, he would record the moment in the Vatican's private chronicles, ensuring that when the history of this day was written, it would include not just the horror, but the redemption found in such small, sacred acts. Before the official closing ceremony, Bellini called the mourners together once more, standing atop the steps of the altar. The Pope's casket remained the centerpiece, draped now with a simple cloth embroidered with the word Veritas, truth. Beside it stood Cecilia, the prayer beads still wrapped around her hand, and in her other palm, the broken shard of marble. Bellini addressed the congregation in a voice that carried clear to the furthest corners of the hall. "We have witnessed darkness," he said, "but we have also witnessed light. Let it be known that we did not turn away. Let it be known that we faced it, and that we rose." He stepped aside, and for the first time, the attention of the world's faithful shifted not to a pope, not to a prince of the church, but to a black woman in a torn robe who stood unbroken among the ruins. Cecilia said no words. She lifted the prayer beads and the marble shard high above her head, offering them both to the heavens in silent testimony. In that moment, no anthem needed to be sung, no sermon needed to be spoken. In that moment, every soul in the basilica understood, and outside, as if heaven itself bore witness, the first true sunlight broke through the clouds, piercing the stained glass windows and setting the fractured interior ablaze with colors too fierce, too vivid, to belong to any earthly world. It bathed Cecilia in gold and crimson and blue, crowned her not with jewels but with light itself, and though the scars of violence would never fully fade, Though the broken statues would one day be repaired, though history would move on as it always did, one thing was now certain. Some wounds are not a sign of weakness. They are proof that something worth defending still lives. And Cecilia Marshall, by standing and refusing to fall, had helped ensure that it would live a little longer. The Vatican settled into a silence unlike any it had known in centuries. Not the reverent quiet of prayer, nor the political hush of diplomacy, but a silence born of reckoning. St. Peter's Basilica stood wounded but upright, a monument to resilience rather than unbroken perfection. Its cracks and scars bore witness to a truth long ignored, that even the most sacred places were not immune to the darkness of human nature. Yet it was within these scars that something new had begun to take root, something stronger than mere ceremony, an awakening. Cecilia Marshall remained in the Vatican for 2 more days after the funeral of Pope Francis, her presence a living reminder of the cost of both hatred and endurance. In those days, she refused all interviews, declined all offers for official statements beyond the one she had already given. She attended no banquets, no private audiences, no staged reconciliations meant to soothe public outrage. Instead, she walked the ruined basilica alone in the early mornings and late evenings, pausing at the shattered remnants of statues, pressing her hand against the cold marble walls as if to absorb the centuries of struggle that had built them. She spoke little. She listened, and the Vatican listened in turn. The Holy See announced sweeping reforms in the handling of security protocols, not with fanfare, but with a solemnity befitting the gravity of what had occurred. New training requirements, new oversight mechanisms, and, most symbolically, the commissioning of a permanent memorial within the basilica itself. Not to Pope Francis, his legacy needed no stone to endure, but to those who suffered unseen, whose dignity had been trampled by fear and ignorance throughout the centuries. It would be the first memorial of its kind inside Vatican City, a tribute not to power, but to perseverance. Cecilia declined an invitation to design or unveil it. "This is not about me," she told Bellini gently. "Let it be about those who never had the chance to speak." Bellini, for his part, honored her wish. Yet he ensured that one line, inscribed in Latin and translated into every major language, would crown the memorial. Dignitas invicta, dignity unconquered. When the day of her departure arrived, the Vatican offered a motorcade, security escorts, and a formal send-off befitting a visiting head of state. Cecilia refused all of it. She chose instead to leave the city by foot, dressed simply, carrying only her few belongings and the prayer beads she had been given. At the ancient gates of the Vatican, Bellini awaited her, flanked by a small delegation of Swiss guards standing at solemn attention. He said nothing as Cecilia approached. He only bowed deeply and without shame, a gesture of respect far greater than any words could offer. Cecilia inclined her head in return, a slight but unmistakable acknowledgment of shared understanding. Then she passed through the gates, her footsteps quiet but sure, fading into the crowded streets beyond. The world outside awaited her, full of noise, judgment, and the endless, grinding machinery of politics. News stations around the globe replayed her confrontation with Dean, dissected every angle of the event, speculated wildly about what it meant for the church, for race relations, for international law. Commentators lauded her bravery. Critics dismissed her as opportunistic. Activists seized upon her image as a new standard for resistance. But Cecilia remained silent. She did not give interviews. She did not write op-eds. She did not tour talk shows or collect awards. Instead, she returned home, quietly resuming her duties at the International Court of Justice. There were still cases to try, still wars to adjudicate, still victims who needed someone to stand between them and the machinery of indifference. Her work had never been about fame, and it would not begin to be now. And yet, the impact of her actions that day in the basilica spread wider than she could ever have predicted. Within months, inspired by the events in Vatican City, a coalition of countries spearheaded a new international convention on the protection of human dignity in religious and public spaces. Laws were drafted. Protocols were rewritten. Embassies updated their training manuals, and security forces underwent retraining focused not just on neutralizing threats, but on preserving the rights of those they were sworn to protect. More importantly, countless individuals, ordinary people whose names would never grace a headline, found renewed courage in Cecilia's silent stand. Stories trickled in from around the world. A teacher who refused to back down when wrongly accused, a teenager who stood up against a school policy rooted in bias, a congregation that welcomed refugees despite mounting threats. They cited no hero. They carried no banners. But somewhere in the marrow of their resistance, there was the echo of a woman who had stood unbroken among shattered statues and smoking candles, refusing to be less than human. In the Vatican, the memorial was completed 6 months after Cecilia's departure. It stood at the far end of the basilica, a place once reserved only for the most exalted. It was simple. A single olive tree, its trunk twisted but unbroken, growing from the fractured remains of a marble statue, left intentionally shattered at its base, its broken pieces fused into the roots. Pilgrims wept before it. Tourists stared at it in stunned silence. Priests knelt before it in prayer. And in the years that followed, the olive tree grew. It became part of the living architecture of the basilica, its roots digging into the ancient stones, its branches stretching slowly toward the vaulted heavens. It did not erase the history that had scarred the Vatican. It did not pretend the violence had never happened. Instead, it bore silent, living testimony to a different truth, that dignity, once claimed, could not be taken away. That even amid ruin, life could rise anew. Cecilia never returned to see the memorial. She didn't need to. She carried its truth with her always, in every courtroom she entered, in every broken system she challenged, in every silent moment when fear pressed close and demanded her surrender. She answered it the same way she had answered in the basilica that night, by standing, bruised but unbowed, prayer beads clenched in one hand, and the memory of a shattered world in the other. And as long as she lived and long after she was gone, others would remember that once, when hatred came roaring through the gates of the holy city, it was not violence that stood victorious. It was a woman. It was dignity. It was hope. And it would not be conquered.